I'm going to talk to Trevor Melanson, the Communications Director for Clean Energy Canada, about a poll that his organization recently conducted. And it's all about the provincial government and BC Hydro and their strategy to electrify the province over the next 10 years, 20 years. And also, there's been a question or two about LNG, which we'll talk about. So, welcome to the interview, Trevor.
Thanks for having me.
Well, this is a very interesting poll. And the first question deals with BC Hydro's 10-year capital plan, $36 billion to expand the grid. And we did a webinar on this about a month ago. And I think, in my opinion, that this is the plan that Hydro should have had 3, 4, 5 years ago. It's a little bit late, but we're happy to have it. And what do the rest of British Columbians, what do they think of it?
Well, a third of them agree with you and that they think it's overdue. And then another 40% say it's the right time. So what you've got there is, three quarters pretty much of British Columbians saying that supporting a $36 billion investment into upgrading BC Hydro. I mean, I think that's a pretty positive result because, we put the dollar figure right in the question. So people understand that this is taxpayer money and they still very strongly support of it. So it's clearly an important issue for them. I think that people are thinking about electricity right now in a way they probably weren't a few years ago. Part of that, of course, is more EVs on the road, and people understanding that we're amid this energy transition. But I think there are some other concerns, like they saw what happened in Alberta during the cold snap and having to send electricity over there. And now people are talking about drought concerns and what that means for BC Hydro. So I think people just have electricity top of mind in a way they probably didn't a few years ago.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the idea of electrifying the economy appears to have caught on in BC in a way that it certainly hasn't in Alberta and Saskatchewan. It's a very different conversation on the prairies when you talk about the expansion of the power grid and electrifying transportation, electrifying buildings, industry, that sort of thing. Well, let's talk about an energy strategy because this is something that has been a personal hobby horse of mine. I have a lot of them, by the way, but this is one. And I think all of the provinces should have an energy strategy. Alberta's is to double down on hydrocarbons for the next 20 years and somehow decarbonize at the same time. I don't know how that's going to happen, but I'm pleased to see that British Columbians understand that there are changes going on at the global level and that BC needs a strategy to cope with that, to adapt to that. And is that what this question was about?
Yeah, it was. There are actually some other provinces that do have energy strategies. Clean Energy Canada put out a white paper a couple of weeks ago examining the different provinces and where they at in sort of developing, what an ideal energy strategy would be. And this is something the province is considering here in BC, which we very much strongly support. And it's not surprising to me that there's really strong support for an energy strategy. In Canada, 47%, that's almost half, say very important, and 36% say somewhat important. So almost everybody says that having an energy strategy is important, and half are saying this is a top priority. That's a very strong poll result. So people absolutely believe that electricity is something that needs to be prioritized and done with foresight. It's not a secondary issue. I think where the government I think where you see lower polling numbers is in people's sort of faith in the government and BC Hydro. They're not bad. We've got a majority of people thinking that they're at least somewhat confident that the province and BC Hydro are going to take the right steps to meet electricity demand. But faith in that is lower than the desire for us to do it right.
Well, the previous BC governments, and maybe this one as well, and Hydro itself, can take some of the blame for that. And that's another kettle of fish we'll leave for a different interview. The third question I want to ask you about is renewable options, because in Canada, say we have 60% hydro in the grid, and in BC, it's like what, 97%, 98%. So BC is very clearly a hydro province, but it's got 30 or 32 dams, and after Site C is finished, it's not building anymore. So in the capital plan, it called for independent power producers like indigenous communities and the private sector and so on to be able to produce solar and wind and so on. And what do British Columbians think about pairing other renewable technologies with hydro?
Yeah, so British Columbians, and I would say Canadians at large, are very supportive of all types of renewables. So we polled a bunch of electricity generation types to see which were the most popular, and the top three are basically hydro, solar, and wind. And they all had a pretty similar result. Actually, BC, so hydropower had slightly more soft support, but solar had more strong support. But they're very much sort of in the same ballpark of popularity, which is interesting. I would say I've seen this poll question multiple times, and hydro is usually third actually after solar and wind. So it actually performs a little better in BC than it would elsewhere in Canada. But I think the takeaway here is that these three power sources are really popular. We also polled energy storage, so people could understand about the relationship between storage and renewables. And again, very popular. And we pulled rooftop solar because distributed energy resources are something we're starting to think about. We think there's low awareness among people in Canada generally. It hasn't really been part of the conversation. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about someone's relationship with the grid and producing their own power. And again, that got a really solid result as well. So that's something that people are interested in.
Yeah, we'll see how BC Hydro responds to that. The big utilities like BCH generally are not all that warm and fuzzy when it comes to consumer produced electricity back into the grid. That tends to be other types of utility models that are more receptive to that. But I think the energy storage is really important because you see it taking off in markets like the US. Texas, California, huge amounts of storage, and how it stabilized the grid, particularly at peak demand, sometimes in the winter, sometimes in the summer. And I've had British Columbia engineers tell me on social media on more than one occasion that a lot of storage in British Columbia would go a long way to providing the kind of electricity that we're going to need in the next 10, 20, 30 years as we electrify the economy and attract more electricity-based industry to BC. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, storage isn't really my area of expertise, but I think certainly, I know we have a lot of hydroelectricity here, so we have a lot of baseload power in BC, and so I think renewables, even variable renewables complement that nicely, and that storage can definitely help out with that. Clean Energy Canada did do a study a year ago where we compared in Alberta and Ontario specifically the cost of wind and solar paired with energy storage, to see how against natural gas, trying to make it a bit more apples to apples. And what we saw, it was still very competitive on price, even when you include storage. So I think, the point, we haven't done that study in BC, but, perhaps you'd see similar results where even, renewables are getting so cheap that even when you include the cost of energy storage, they're still competitive.
Okay, well, let's get on to something that is more in your wheelhouse. The fourth question is about support for renewables versus LNG. And I have to say that this caught me a bit by surprise. I thought there would be more support for LNG given the economic benefits that BC has enjoyed from the $40 billion LNG Canada construction up in Kitimat, but that doesn't appear to be the case.
No, so I mean, very interesting result here. We've pulled this question multiple times now, and it's actually kind of continued in the same trajectory of renewables being more popular than LNG in terms of which energy source would people prefer the province focus on. And now it's 69% of people say renewables as opposed to only 15% with LNG. And again, that trend in favor of renewables has increased over time. I think the point I like to make here is that when people think of LNG as a free lunch, it's probably going to pull better. But when people think of LNG in a choice context where, well, you can do more of one or we can do more of the other, we only have so much electricity. What do we want to use it for? Where do we want to spend our taxpayer dollars? When you think of it this way, LNG starts pulling a lot worse because people will take, a free lunch, but when they're making choices between trade-offs, this isn't their first choice. And that's what we start to see in these poll questions. And in fact, the idea of electrifying LNG, most people do not support taxpayer dollars going to do that. They think the companies should foot the bill themselves.
And that would be a pretty hefty bill because we've seen some of the estimates of the discounts that the BC government has offered LNG producers to electrify their operations. So let's get on to the last question, which is about emerging economic development opportunities for BC. And this one really caught my attention because we've been spending a lot of time here at Energy Media talking about manufacturing clean technologies, the solar panels, the wind turbines, the EV batteries, the EVs themselves, all of those core technologies in the energy transition that China is just, I mean, overwhelmingly committed to, or has scaled up the manufacture of and driven down the cost. But now we see the US, which is our primary trading partner, responding to that with the Inflation Reduction Act and its determination to build its own clean energy manufacturing and supply chains. So big opportunity for British Columbia if we jump on it. And do you think that based on these poll results, that British Columbians understand the magnitude of the opportunity that's in front of them?
I think they do. To the extent that they're connecting it with the Inflation Reduction Act and specific things happening out there in the world. I mean, they may have a more vague sense of it than a specific one, would be my guess. I think there's a broad understanding that, yes, we're moving to electricity and electric vehicles and heat pumps and electrification broadly. And I think you do see that in poll questions we've asked, not just around, do you want an EV or what do you think of them, but do you think they're the future? You do see the majorities of people do think that, people may have a different sense of what timeline these things are on. That's where you get a little more disagreement, but most people, not all people, but most people do think these things are kind of inevitable. And so, it's not too surprising to me that when we pulled a bunch of we framed it as economic opportunities that BC is considering in its future. So we picked things that have been in the news and have been talked about. And renewable electricity came out number one, manufacturing clean technologies came out number two, and then clean hydrogen and sustainably produced metals and minerals and mass timber were kind of next. And then actually exporting LNG was on the bottom of all the options that we pulled people on.
Yeah, it's an interesting mix because the top three are really all about clean energy in one way. Either you're producing the clean energy in the form of electricity or hydrogen, or you're manufacturing the equipment that does that. And the sort of traditional BC focus on forestry and on gas, on natural resources, really comes in much lower in the there's much less support for it than I would have expected.
Yeah, I mean, we with this question, we try to focus on things that were a bit more emerging or kind of in the news, as opposed to polling every sort of legacy sector that BC has. So even when we did poll mining and forestry in a sense, but we focused on the aspect of it that was more tied to emerging trends, like including mass timber, right? Being a value add to the forestry sector that's been talked about a lot over the past few years. So, I can't say exactly how these things would poll against, tech or real estate, or mining, forestry in a broader sense. But certainly, in terms of the new growing things that people want to focus on, clean energy related ones come out strongly on top.
Great, Trevor. Really appreciate your insights, and as your organization continues its polling, we'll have you back to talk about the new polls.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, Markham.